Japan never expected Americans would strafe 3,000 convoy survivors. March 3, 1943. Bismarck Sea off New Guinea. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura led Destroyer Squadron 3. 8 destroyers screening 8 transports carrying about 6,900 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division. Opposing them, Lieutenant General George Kenney's U.S. 5th Air Force prepared B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, each modified by Major Paul Gunn, with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Browning machine guns. Their mission: stop any Japanese reinforcement of Leh by any means necessary. The morning sun rose over the Bismarck Sea as Admiral Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship. Behind him, the destroyer Shiryuki marked the stern of a formation that was Japan's last major attempt to move troops to New Guinea by sea. 8 transports rolled in the swell, their holds full of soldiers, ammunition, fuel, and with them the fate of Japanese operations in the Southwest Pacific. Around those transports, 8 destroyers held a protective ring, anti-aircraft guns trained skyward, and crews watching the horizon for American aircraft they expected. Kimura had graduated 107th of 118 from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. Not a standout record, but combat had taught him harsh lessons. He had helped rescue survivors from the heavy cruiser Makuma after American bombers struck her at Midway. He knew what air power could do to ships caught in daylight without fighter cover. Still, Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters left him no choice. The troops aboard these transports were desperately needed at Leh. The only alternative was an overland march of more than 140 miles through disease-ridden, roadless jungle. The convoy left Simpson Harbor at Rabaul just after midnight on March 1st, timing its run with storm fronts for concealment. Kimura's destroyers were among the Imperial Navy's most battle-hardened: Shiryuki, Shikonami, Uranami, Tokitsuke, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo. Many had survived brutal fighting around Guadalcanal. Their crews were veterans of night actions, in which Japanese destroyer tactics had outmatched American forces. Daylight in waters dominated by American land-based aircraft, however, was a different problem. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, was aboard the destroyer Tokitsuke. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division sailed on Yukikaze. The presence of such senior officers highlighted how critical this convoy was. These were not expendable replacements, but key formations, whose arrival at Leh could decide whether Japan held its foothold in New Guinea. At Port Moresby, Lieutenant General George C. Kenney studied reconnaissance photos of the convoy, like a hunter reading tracks. Kenney had arrived in the Southwest Pacific in July 1942 to find General Douglas MacArthur's air forces low on morale and ineffective. Medium-altitude bombing against moving ships had produced hit rates under 1%. But Kenney had 2 advantages his predecessors lacked: an innovative mindset, willing to challenge doctrine, and the engineering skill to turn bold ideas into practical changes. Standing with him over the photos was Major Paul Papy Gunn, a former enlisted Navy aviator whose wife and children remained in the Philippines. Gunn had poured personal anger into radical aircraft modifications. He realized that attacking ships meant getting very close, and that required suppressing shipboard anti-aircraft fire before dropping bombs. His solution: remove the bombardier position from B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and install 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose and side. Pods built these modified B-25C1s had already shown impressive results. Each 50 fired about 850 rounds per minute, with armor-piercing, incendiary and tracer rounds at roughly 2,110 feet per second. 8 guns firing together could send about 6,800 rounds per minute into a target, enough to rip superstructure and decimate anti-aircraft crews. The tactic combined this frontal firepower with skip bombing. Pilots approached at wave-top height and released bombs about 500 yards from the target. The bombs would skip across the water like stones and strike the hull near or below the waterline, where armor was weakest. Kenney and Gunn knew that success here would mean more than sinking ships. This convoy was Japan's last realistic chance to reinforce Leh. If it reached port, Japanese forces might stabilize in New Guinea and even threaten Australia. If it failed, Japan would be forced to rely on submarines and small coastal barges, effectively ceding control of New Guinea's waters to the Allies. The modified B-25s represented a clear break from pre-war bombing doctrine. Before the war, precision from medium altitude using the Norden bomb site had been the ideal. But moving ships could easily evade bombs dropped from 10,000 feet. Skip bombing solved that by cutting release altitude to under 250 feet and reducing time of flight to seconds rather than minutes. Major Ed Liner commanded the 90th Bombardment Squadron, B-25s chosen to lead the skip bombing attack. He trained his crews relentlessly, using a half-submerged wreck in Port Moresby Harbour for practice. Pilots learned to use fixed reference points on the aircraft nose instead of the Norden to time their bomb release for the flat trajectory skip. One crew died when their B-25 struck its target's foremast during practice, but Liner's remaining crews achieved exceptional accuracy with the unconventional method. The B-25C-1 Mitchell that would carry out Kenny's plan was at the cutting edge of 1943. Aviation adapted for a mission its designers had not intended. The B-25C-1 weighed about 21,100 pounds empty and could carry some 200 pounds of bombs at a maximum speed near 275 mph. But the gun modifications transformed these aircraft into offensive weapons. Built for low-level attacks, medium bombers were transformed into something entirely new. Aircraft capable of both strafing and bombing with devastating efficiency. Their forward-firing armament alone weighed over 2,200 pounds, including guns, ammunition, and reinforced mounts built to withstand the intense recoil produced by 8 machine guns firing at once. The Royal Australian Air Force played a vital supporting role in General Kenny's attack. 13. Bristol Beaufighter twin-engine aircraft from No. 30 Squadron joined the mission, each armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, perfect for suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Unlike the American B-25s, these planes were designed as fighters from the start, featuring armor protection for pilots and self-sealing fuel tanks to survive battle damage. Their job was to clear the decks of enemy gunners just before the skip bombers struck, increasing the Americans' odds of surviving their low-level bombing runs. At dawn on March 2nd, the Japanese convoy was about 200 miles from Lae. Despite realizing that Allied reconnaissance planes had spotted them, the ships held their course and speed. Admiral Kimura's radio operators intercepted growing volumes of American transmissions, a clear sign that preparations for an attack were underway. Kimura now faced a difficult decision: maintain course toward Lae and face an inevitable air assault, or scatter his convoy and risk heavy losses to submarines in the narrow waters leading to New Guinea. The first American attack came at 10 a.m. when 8 B-17 flying fortresses approached from 7,000 feet. These 4-engine bombers embodied America's pre-war belief in precision, high-altitude attacks designed to destroy industrial and naval targets. But their effectiveness was limited. The B-17s dropped 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs that produced dramatic water plumes, but scored only one direct hit, sinking the transport Kyokusei Maru. More importantly, the attack broke up the convoy's tight formation, leaving the ships vulnerable to the low-level assault General Kenny had planned. From the bridge of Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura observed the scattered ships with growing concern. One transport was gone, others were dispersed over several miles, and this was just the first strike. Recent intelligence had revealed that American air power in New Guinea had grown rapidly, introducing new aircraft types and tactics that Japan had yet to face. Kimura's greatest fear was not the bombs themselves, but that his ships would be scattered and unable to provide mutual anti-aircraft defense when the main assault came. Through the night of March 2nd, 3rd, Royal Australian Air Force PBY Catalina flying boats shadowed the convoy, transmitting its position so Kenny's forces could plan with precision. These twin-engine seaplanes could stay airborne for over 20 hours, ideal for long-range reconnaissance. The crews knew maintaining contact was essential, even though their slow aircraft were easy targets for Japanese fighters. By dawn on March 3rd, the sea was calm and clear. Kimura's convoy had already lost 1/8 of its transport capacity and was still 60 miles from Lae. His destroyers had rescued 950 survivors from Kyokusei Maru, but were now dangerously overcrowded, carrying hundreds of soldiers on top of their normal crews. Worse, the scattered formation meant that any future attack would hit individual ships, not a concentrated defensive group. At 7:30 a.m., reconnaissance aircraft reported Allied bombers taking off from Port Moresby. Kimura ordered his ships to tighten formation and prepare for coordinated evasive maneuvers, but he knew the situation was grim. Japanese air cover, about 100 fighters based near Leh, did not have the range to protect the convoy continuously. The Americans, however, could launch multiple, precisely timed waves from various airfields using different aircraft types. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea began at 10 a.m. on March 3rd, when the first wave of Allied planes appeared on the horizon. Kimura ordered all ships to increase speed and take evasive action, but his convoy's formation restricted maneuverability. The heavily loaded transports could not match the speed or agility of the destroyers, forcing the faster warships to either stay with their slower escorts or leave them behind. 13 RAF Beaufighters soon appeared at wavetop height, their twin engines roaring, a sound Japanese lookouts had come to dread. Originally designed as night fighters equipped with early radar, these aircraft proved just as deadly in daylight strafing runs. Each carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons capable of ripping through light armor and destroying deck equipment with explosive shells. Their attack followed Kenny's plan precisely. All 13 aircraft attacked from the starboard side, concentrating Japanese defensive fire in one direction and leaving other sectors exposed. This opened the path for the modified B-25s to begin their deadly skip bombing runs. Every pilot knew success depended on flawless timing between the various aircraft types, each with vastly different capabilities. Major Lowther led 12 B-25C-1 strafers in just seconds after the Beaufighters' attack. Flying at only 30 feet above the waves and 230 mph, the bombers were nearly impossible for Japanese gunners to track. Conventional anti-aircraft training focused on medium-altitude attacks, giving defenders time to aim. Skip bombing eliminated that advantage. The scene attack was over in seconds. The roar of Lowther's B-25s was unlike anything the Japanese had heard before. 850 caliber machine guns firing together sounded, as one survivor described, like a giant canvas tearing apart. Each bomber carried nearly 4,000 rounds of mixed ammunition, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. At just 200 yards, their fire could pierce a destroyer's hull and cut down exposed crew with horrific power. Shirayuki was the first to take a full burst from Lowther's lead plane, just as Kimura ordered evasive turns. The gunfire swept across the bridge, killing or wounding most officers there. Kimura himself was hit in the shoulder and stomach, wounds that would have been fatal without immediate care. The same attack destroyed the destroyer's main fire control system, leaving its guns without direction. The skip bombing tactics developed by Gunn and Lowther were devastating against ships designed for high-altitude attacks. Traditional naval armor protected vital areas like magazines and engine rooms from bombs falling from above. Skip bombs, however, struck from the side, tearing through thinner hull sections. A single 500-pound bomb exploding against a destroyer's side could flood multiple compartments and sink the ship within minutes. Transport vessels were even more defenseless. Built for cargo, not combat, they lacked armor and watertight compartments. When B-25s attacked Teiomaru, their gunfire slaughtered soldiers packed in the holds, while bombs ripped open her hull. The ship began sinking almost immediately, forcing hundreds of men into the sea, soon covered in oil, debris, and blood. The destruction of Kimura's convoy unfolded with mechanical precision. Each Allied wave found its scattered targets and attacked without opposition. B-17s bombed from altitude, while B-25s and A-20 Havocs attacked at low level, forcing Japanese gunners to split their fire between threats from above and the sea's surface. By afternoon, the convoy was shattered. Ships burned, sank, or drifted helplessly. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were in the water, clinging to wreckage or small boats. Most landing craft had been destroyed before they could even launch. Those that survived carried only a fraction of the men once aboard the convoy. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had turned into a one-sided catastrophe, an operation that demonstrated how precision, coordination, and innovation in air tactics could destroy even the most heavily escorted naval force. Admiral Kimura, badly wounded and bleeding, was moved from the sinking Shiroyuki to the destroyer Shikonami while American planes kept attacking. From his new flagship, he watched the disaster spread. All 8 transports were either sinking or burning. 3 of his 8 destroyers had been sunk or so badly damaged they were out of action. The carefully planned reinforcement of Leh had turned into a massacre. Thousands of elite Japanese soldiers died before they could fire a shot to defend New Guinea. The 4 destroyers still able to operate, Shikonami, Yukaes, Uranami, and Asagumo, began rescue work at once. They pulled survivors from oil-slicked water as fast as their crews could. Each ship had been built to carry roughly 240 officers and men. Now they took aboard hundreds more survivors from the stricken transports. Overcrowding became so severe that some survivors were lashed to decks. They were exposed to further air attack, but alive when they might otherwise have drowned. Lieutenant General George Kenny read the first reports of the attack with satisfaction. He knew, however, that the battle was not finished. Intelligence estimated that over 6,000 Japanese troops had been on the convoy's transports. Many were still alive in the water, in lifeboats or in landing craft that survived the initial strikes. If those men reached shore, they could reinforce Leh's garrison and possibly stabilize Japanese positions in New Ether. Kenny's decision on the afternoon of March 3rd would make the Battle of the Bismarck Sea one of the most controversial episodes of the Pacific War. At a staff conference, Major General Ennis Whitehead, Kenny's deputy, pointed out that hundreds of Japanese remained alive in lifeboats, rafts and landing craft scattered across the area. Many of those boats had small engines and might reach the New Guinea coast in days. Even powerless craft could drift ashore or be picked up by Japanese submarines. Kenny's reply, later remembered by air crews who carried out the orders, was blunt. "I want every goddamn Japanese in the water killed. I don't want any of them reaching shore to fight us again." His language reflected the brutal intensity of Pacific combat and a calculation that eliminating these survivors was a military necessity. These were not merchant sailors or passengers. They were elite troops whose survival could affect future battles. Orders sent to Allied squadrons that afternoon were called mopping up operations. Their intent, however, was clear. Aircraft were told to find and attack any lifeboats, rafts, or vessels carrying Japanese survivors. Air crews were told these men were soldiers who would rejoin the fight if rescued, not helpless shipwreck victims. Some pilots accepted that reasoning. Others struggled with orders that seemed to clash with older notions of military honor. Royal Australian Air Force Squadron 30 got the first specific instructions to strafe survivors. On the afternoon of March 3rd, 10 Bristol Beaufort fighters took off from Milne Bay with orders to locate and destroy any barges, lifeboats, or rafts still afloat. The pilots found targets spread across nearly 20 square miles of ocean. They saw Type A and Type B landing craft carrying 30 to 90 survivors each, standard lifeboats with 6 to 12 men, and improvised rafts made from debris. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Uren led the first organized strafing attack on survivors. His Beauforts, using 420mm cannons, tore apart a Type A landing craft carrying about 60 soldiers. The explosive shells, meant to destroy aircraft, shredded the unarmored boats into deadly splinters that killed or badly wounded everyone on board. Uren's wingman hit a second landing craft with similar results. Only wreckage and bodies floated in water that turned red with blood. The psychological effect on Allied air crews varied widely. Some pilots, especially those who had seen Japanese atrocities against prisoners or civilians, carried out the missions with little hesitation. Others were deeply disturbed. Many described nausea and shame that lasted long after the war. Squadron commanders generally backed the missions as militarily necessary, while admitting the moral ambiguity involved. American B-25 crews received comparable orders on March 4th to seek out and destroy any remaining survivors or rescue vessels. Captain Charles Howe of the 90th Bombardment Squadron reported attacking a group of lifeboats and rafts about 40 miles southeast of Finch Schaefer. He fired 2,500 rounds of .50 caliber in 3 strafing passes. His after-action report stated that the people in the water had been definitely put out of action, a military euphemism that avoided naming the mass killing explicitly. The systematic hunting of Japanese survivors continued for 3 days after the main battle. Allied aircraft scoured hundreds of square miles to make sure no one escaped. U.S. Navy PT boats also joined in. They used machine guns at point-blank range during night operations. Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins led 8 PT boats and later reported destroying many lifeboats and causing the deaths of hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors. Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 tried to rescue survivors on the nights of March 4 and 5. They recovered 275 men before Allied patrols forced them to dive. These boats were among Japan's most advanced submarines, but they could only take a small number of survivors. Their commanders faced agonizing choices about whom to save, often leaving wounded men behind while taking those with better chances of survival. The moral complexity of the strafing operations showed up in the mixed reactions of Allied air crews. Co-pilot First Lieutenant John Donegan of the 405th Bombardment Squadron wrote in his diary, "Our destruction was not for mercy. It was simply that to us all Japanese soldiers had become things to be annihilated, not necessarily cruel, but always thoroughly." This dehumanization reflected months of brutal combat, where quarter was rarely given by either side. Other airmen questioned whether attacking defenseless survivors fit international law. Several Australian pilots felt disgusted by the missions. Squadron commanders usually countered such concerns by stressing the military need to prevent enemy reinforcement and reminding crews of Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners and civilians. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea went beyond the immediate loss of Kimura's convoy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, called the defeat unbelievable. He said it was a crushing blow that changed Japan's ability to operate in the Southwest Pacific. The loss of 8 transports and 4 destroyers consumed a significant share of Japan's remaining merchant shipping. Those vessels could not be easily replaced, especially given American submarine attacks on Japanese shipbuilding and supply lines. More importantly, the battle showed that Japan could no longer move large convoys through waters dominated by Allied land-based aircraft. Future reinforcement efforts were now far more difficult. Under the new Allied air strategy, Japan would have to depend on submarines, small coastal craft, and perilous land routes, options Japanese planners had tried to avoid. This logistical breakdown proved decisive in the New Guinea campaign, forcing Japanese troops to fight with limited supplies and reinforcements while Allied strength steadily increased. The legal implications of strafing survivors would not become clear until after the war. The 1949 Geneva Convention specifically banned attacks on shipwrecked military personnel, a rule many historians believe was directly influenced by incidents like the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. During World War II, however, there were no clear international laws protecting survivors of sunken warships. Commanders often made decisions based on military necessity and personal morality. A similar moral dilemma arose in German submarine warfare. The Laconia incident of September 1942 saw the German U-boat U-156 attempt to rescue survivors from a torpedoed British ship, only to be attacked by Allied aircraft, despite displaying Red Cross flags. In response, Germany issued the Laconia Order, forbidding submarine rescue operations and effectively condemning thousands of Allied sailors in later attacks. The parallels between the Laconia incident and the Bismarck Sea strafing reflected the total war mentality of World War II, where notions of military honor often clashed with perceived necessity. These events forced both German and Allied commanders to accept moral compromises that would have been unthinkable in earlier conflicts, but were seen as justified in a global struggle. Post-war, analysis of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed how revolutionary tactics had reshaped naval warfare. Skip bombing, developed by Paul Gunn and Ed Larner, proved far more effective against ships than traditional high-altitude bombing. Modified B-25 bombers, armed with heavy forward-facing guns, could deliver devastating firepower while retaining their bomb-carrying capacity. These innovations would shape aircraft design and combat tactics for decades. The human cost of the battle reflected the brutality of the Pacific War. Around 3,000 Japanese troops, including many from the elite 51st Division, were killed or went missing. Allied losses were minimal, only 13 airmen and 4 aircraft, highlighting the advantage of technological innovation and tactical surprise. For the families of the Japanese dead, statistics brought no comfort. Admiral Masatomi Kimura survived his wounds and was evacuated to Japan, but his career ended with the defeat. In later interviews, he expressed deep frustration over the lack of air cover for his convoy and the unrealistic expectations placed on his fleet. Like many Japanese officers, Kimura struggled to grasp how Japan's early dominance in naval aviation had been overturned by American industry and tactics. Allied airmen who took part in the strafing carried those memories differently. Some, like Captain Charles Howe, defended their actions as necessary to end the war sooner and save Allied lives. Others, haunted by the sight of lifeboats destroyed and wounded men killed, found no justification strong enough to ease their guilt. Many would later show symptoms now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Major Paul Gunn continued to refine his aircraft modifications throughout the war. Producing B-25 variants with up to 18 forward-firing guns, his work influenced future designs, such as the Douglas A-26 Invader. Gunn's motivation was deeply personal. Every Japanese casualty, he believed, meant one less threat to his family still in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time, and reflecting both the scale of the victory and its propaganda value. Strategically, the battle isolated Japanese forces in New Guinea, cutting them off from resupply. Leh fell in September 1943, followed by other strongholds as Allied momentum grew. The technological legacy of the battle extended far beyond aviation. Skip bombing demonstrated the power of challenging traditional doctrine when new conditions demanded innovation. Conventional medium-altitude bombing had failed against ships, but creative adaptation had achieved remarkable results. This spirit of innovation under pressure defined much of America's wartime technological progress. The moral questions raised by the strafing of survivors remain debated even 8 decades later. Historians largely agree the attacks violated traditional military ethics, though they also acknowledge the lack of clear international law at the time. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, which explicitly protected shipwrecked military personnel, were in part a response to incidents like this. Any modern assessment of the battle must also consider the wider brutality of the Pacific War. Japanese forces were notorious for cruel treatment of prisoners, while Allied troops, exposed to such atrocities, often sought revenge. This cycle of dehumanization made actions like the strafing more likely, even as many participants recognized the moral weight of their decisions. Ultimately, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed both the devastating effectiveness of new military tactics and the ethical challenges of total war. Kimura's convoy represented Japan's last real chance to reinforce New Guinea by sea. General Kenny's air assault ensured no such effort would succeed again. The victory cost Japan 3,000 lives and left Allied air crews burdened with lasting moral conflict. The innovations of the battle reshaped aviation for decades, while the ethical questions it raised helped form the foundation of modern humanitarian law. Both legacies, technological progress, and moral reckoning illustrate how wartime necessity and human conscience often collide. The men who fought and died in the Bismarck Sea deserve remembrance not only for their courage and sacrifice, but for the difficult choices forced upon them. As the sun set on March 5, 1943, the waters of the Bismarck Sea were strewn with debris and bodies, marking Japan's last failed attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea. The strategic consequences shaped the rest of the Pacific War, while the moral lessons endured, echoing through international law and military ethics for generations. The battle stood as a symbol of both America's technological might and the moral complexities of modern warfare.